Incredibly, he hadn't won a Grand Prix since the Australian back in early April, despite having managed 6 pole positions so far this season. And Charles Leclerc had never before won a Grand Prix other than from pole position. In Austria, starting second, it seemed, worked out just fine for the 24-year-old. His 3rd win of the season, his 5th in his career, puts him back in 2nd place in the World Drivers' Championship standings. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our F1 show. Thanks for joining us. Plenty to unpack tonight as we look back at yesterday's Austrian Grand Prix. And what do we talk about tonight? We've got the World Drivers' Championship fight gets a little tighter for Max Verstappen, just a little bit. Mick Schumacher's 2nd consecutive points finish. Lap times deleted and other inquiries for the stewards. And of course, if you've got any questions for myself and our guest host, who you'll see in a moment, please do send them over to us using the usual @GoF1 handle. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And let's get straight over to my mate in Formula One. His name is Alex Yoong. He's joining us, I think, from Tokyo tonight. How are you, Alex?
Good, mate. Actually, from Suzuka. We're at the track preparing for a race this weekend.
There you go. Fantastic. Now, let's have a quick recap, if we can, the sort of the top points of what happened in yesterday's Austrian Grand Prix. I think Miko prepared for us a slide to show us those kind of key elements of what happened in the race yesterday.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty exciting, wasn't it? I mean, we know Verstappen won, but he didn't have it all his own way, did he? I mean, Leclerc overtook Verstappen on lap 12, and we're thinking, wow, Ferrari looking really good here. Verstappen stopped pretty much the next lap. And then we saw a pattern here. You know, Leclerc stopping 13 laps longer, so obviously Ferrari doing better with tyre wear. But because Verstappen stopped earlier, that always put him back in front of both of the Ferraris. So Leclerc actually had to overtake him a further 2 times to get back in front. And of course, there was that 3rd stop just during the virtual safety car towards the end. And, you know, Ferrari looked good for a 1-2, and Sainz was really closing in on Verstappen to take that 2nd place away from him as well. But then had that big DNF, that big engine fire. Engine let go in a big way, and wow, Verstappen will count his lucky stars because he was able to finish 2nd with Leclerc, and really didn't lose that many points to Leclerc if you compare for the whole weekend.
Absolutely. Let's get straight into it with Charles Leclerc. Took the lead on lap 12. Pretty straightforward 2-stop race, would you say?
Yeah, but I mean, yes, it looked simple, didn't it? But I wouldn't say it was that simple. You know, I mean, the Ferrari looked really good, and when he was catching Verstappen, he looked like he was closing quite easily, and then he was able to get past him, but he still had to overtake him 3 times. And Max Verstappen is probably the hardest driver on the whole grid to overtake, and I must say, Leclerc is showing, you know, he's just showing that wonderful skill, you know, and I love to see him battle with Verstappen. You know, we saw it in Saudi Arabia, and we saw it again here in Austria, because especially that first move into turn 3 down the inside of Verstappen, you know, that took full commitment, and he could have easily snatched the front brake and got it completely wrong, but he didn't. So a very tidy drive from Leclerc, and he really needed one, huh? He's been on a long run of not winning, so perfect for him.
Yeah, not only not winning, hasn't won, as we said at the top of the show, since the Australian Grand Prix back in early April, but he hasn't had a top 3 finish in any of the last 5 races, despite qualifying inside the top 3 4 out of those 5 times. So tell me, Alex, as a Grand Prix driver, when it's, as you said, he's overtaken for the lead 3 times, it's lap 61, and he suddenly feels his throttle pedal isn't returning properly. How exactly would he be feeling at that point?
Oh, he'd be going, no. I mean, that's, gosh, you just think everything's going against you at that point. And sometimes in sports, not just Formula One, you get these roles where it's really hard to break out of it. And you do need a bit of, well, it's not really lucky to have this throttle issue, but it could have been worse. It could have meant he didn't retire. So he needed a bit of luck to make sure it wasn't quite bad enough to stop him from finishing the race and getting his win.
And when that was happening, what were you thinking to yourself, as I was? How do you drive when the throttle isn't coming back fully? Are you scooping it with your foot? There's not a lot of room in the foot box anyway. I mean, it's not designed for people to do ballet dancing, is it?
Well, I mean, Leclerc would have felt that straight away. You know, with the old cables we back in the day when we used to drive, you could kind of tap the throttle a little bit, and that might loosen it up. But Leclerc would have felt that straight away that something was up. And I think as a driver, he'd have been extremely analytical about it. He'd have been like, okay, is it the same every time? If it's the same every time, I can maybe prepare for it and I can drive it. But if it's not the same every time, is it getting worse? Because if it's getting worse, then it becomes a safety issue. Because what if it stays flat chat, 100% throttle when I hit the brakes? I'm in for a big, big accident. And as a driver, you have to think these split-second decisions, because if you think it's going to go at 100% and get worse, then that's your life on the line. The Red Bull ring has got a lot of runoff area, but you're in for a very, very big accident. But you'd be analysing this, going, no, and I'm sure Leclerc was going, no, I think it's been consistently this 30% extra throttle. I'll find a way to drive around it. I'd brake a little bit earlier and manage it. And for him, I'm sure, like most drivers, the most important thing was finishing and getting the win.
Absolutely. And there was another problem, wasn't it? Because on lap 58, I think if I'm right in saying, when 56, we saw his teammate Carlos Sainz suddenly pulling to the side of the track they say it was an internal combustion engine failure, but most of the combustion engine was external to the car, as we saw here, massively on fire.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that kind of fire since a long time, like the 80s old turbo fires. That would have made... let's talk about, first of all, how Carlos must have felt about this, let alone Charles.
I think Carlos was just thinking he was seeing his podium position vanish because he was chasing Verstappen. He knows he could have probably taken second at this point. So he'd been concerned about that. I can't speak for him, obviously, but, I think the fire was under control and he would have got out of that quite swiftly. It wasn't like he was trapped. If he was trapped, then he'd be worried. But he just had to exit quickly, I think.
Absolutely. Fourth time this year, poor Carlos Sainz has failed to finish. And actually, I think it's four times this year that Charles has failed to finish and lost a victory. So, he knows how it feels as keenly as his teammate does. We've got a first question that's coming in now from friend of the show, John the Storyteller. And he's asking, he says, please for Mick Schumacher, aren't we all? And we'll discuss Mick a little bit later in the show. He's saying, where is this extra pace? He's calling it extra race pace. Where's it coming from, the extra race pace in the Ferrari? What are your thoughts on that, Alex?
I think Ferrari just getting on top of their looking after the front tyres a little bit better, making the tyres wear a bit better. Let's remember the Imola when Charles Leclerc was winning, but the tyre wear at the front was not so good, and Verstappen got on at the end. So I think Ferrari just got a little bit of a better handle on that. I also think the track suits them a bit better, because you just talked about Mick having a good weekend. Well, that's a Ferrari-powered car as well. So, Haas and Ferrari had a good weekend. And a little bit, Red Bull Ring is more high speed than Australia. But actually, the corners are kind of similar. So it's not too far away from Australia. So I'm not surprised to see Ferrari go well here and Haas go well here because of how strong we saw them in Melbourne.
And you predicted it, actually. You're doing rather well with the prediction. I need to take some notes about what you're saying and perhaps go down to the local bookmakers. Before I do that, let's look at the results from the 2022 Austrian Grand Prix. We've talked about Charles Leclerc winning it from Max Verstappen, who took fastest lap and the point that goes with it. The two Mercedes cars up next, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. We'll, of course, look into that in great detail later. Ahead of Esteban Ocon for Alpine, Mick Schumacher there in sixth with the Haas with the Ferrari engine in the back. Lando Norris seventh and his teammate Daniel Ricciardo ninth for McLaren. Kevin Magnussen in the second Haas, I'll call it here, in eighth, and Fernando Alonso rounding out the top 10 for Alpine. Let's look at P2 leading the World Championship, but let's rewind slightly. He took pole position, this is Max Verstappen I'm talking about, on Friday, the 16th of his career, by just 29 one-thousandths of a second from Charles and 82 one-thousandths from Sainz, so it's pretty close. And then he won the sprint by just about 1.6 seconds. So the simple question is, was it just a matter of not having race pace, do you think, here this weekend for the Red Bulls, for Verstappen?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Ferrari was slightly better than the Red Bull here this weekend. We talked about it earlier, didn't we, Matt, how it was strange how Verstappen could hold up Leclerc in the sprint race, but couldn't quite do it in the feature race. And I think it's just because how fine the margins are, because Verstappen was advantaged by the fact that both the Ferraris were fighting behind him. And I know when Verstappen would have seen that in the mirror, he'd been going, I don't need to be 5-6 seconds up the road here. I just need to be out of DRS and managing my tires. And that's what Leclerc said, because Leclerc said once he got past the science, he knows that Verstappen had some fresher tires, and it was hard for him to close the gap. It wasn't that Leclerc wasn't trying, in the sprint race. It's just that Verstappen had a little bit better tires because he was able to manage it in the early part of the race. And that's why it's so close. That's why this battle is so fascinating between them. We're seeing such fine margins. I keep going back to the Saudi Arabia battle because it was such a great battle between the two of them. The two drivers right at the top of the game, just about getting through it and keeping it just out of the wall. And then here again, we saw another episode of it. Leclerc had to make the moments work, in that feature race when he got past Verstappen, making those overtakes. That's a slight difference we see between Leclerc and Sainz. Sainz in the same position in Canada wasn't able to quite do it. And that's why I'm really loving this battle between this man, Max Verstappen, and Leclerc.
So what you're saying is that the two Ferrari drivers fighting in the sprint, I think this is what you're saying, meant that they weren't exposing the tyre weakness, the degradation weakness that Max and the Red Bull had, and he got away with it in the sprint. We saw Leclerc getting back towards him at the end of the sprint, but too little too late. But in the race itself, that seemed to be the problem, right? It was the rear tyre degradation on the Red Bull on this rear limited circuit. What does that mean? When people say rear limited, front limited, easy to say. I just said it, and it does sound very easy to say. It is very easy to say. What does it mean?
Okay, so, because we were talking about it, Mark Hughes was talking about it the other day, wasn't he? So basically, front limited, rear limited, we're talking about which axle gets stressed the most in the car at each track. Like, for example, Barcelona and Silverstone, those are front limited tracks because it's all these high-speed, long corners, and it tends to chew up the front tire a lot more. Imola's a little bit like that as well. You got to send it through the corners. But then you go places like Melbourne, Baku, I think is also another track like that, although it's Baku's rear limited, and so is Red Bull Ring, because you got to brake hard, turn the car, and then a lot of traction on the way out, so you're kind of really spooling up the rear tires quite a lot. So that does happen a lot. So that's what I think was happening here. We've seen the Ferrari perhaps be a bit weaker at front limited tracks, but the Red Bull seems to be a little bit weaker at rear limited tracks, like in Red Bull Ring. That's not the only reason why they went slow here, though. We also knew the Ferrari would go quick here because it has a great power unit and it's got this great slow speed traction.
Great, nice one. So that summarizes that. Let's now look at the World Drivers' Championship, because we know that Charles Leclerc has closed the gap from 43 to 38 points. But actually, that gap is larger than it was before, because with Carlos Sainz not scoring any points. Previously, Max Verstappen only had a 34-point advantage over Sergio Perez, his teammate. Sergio only scored 4 points this weekend in the sprint, didn't finish in the Grand Prix. We'll look into that in a moment. But there it is then, Max Verstappen leading by 38 points from Charles, who now moves into second ahead of Sergio Perez. Carlos Sainz only got 5 points this weekend as well, again from the sprinter course with that engine failure in the Grand Prix. He lines up fourth now. Russell and Hamilton still fifth and sixth. Lando Norris still seventh. Esteban Ocon moves up one now to eighth, ahead of Valtteri Bottas, who drops down one, and then Fernando Alonso just gets into the top 10 for Alpine. Let's have a look at the comparison between Max and Charles, that graph that we've been developing as the season goes on, because I say Charles now second, was 43 points, now 38 points. Verstappen, I think it's right to say, Alex, limited the damage, didn't he, of losing the Grand Prix by winning the sprint and second taking fastest lap in the Grand Prix.
And Leclerc has to take his chances, and this is the thing, where Ferrari have to do that. Like, Sainz needed to finish second today, on Sunday, to try and make the gap a bit bigger between Leclerc taking more points off Verstappen. Leclerc needed to win that race at Silverstone. The race just gone by, so Ferrari, we talked about it quite a lot already, how they've been missing the chances, shall I say, in the first half of this championship. But we are only halfway through the championship, aren't we, Matt? There's still another 11 races to go. So there's still plenty of time for Leclerc and Ferrari to turn it around.
Yeah, well, I did the calculation. 11 races times 26 points. It's 260 plus 26. Plus 8, because there's another sprint race. I think we've got 294 points available to overcome that 38-point disadvantage that Charles has at the moment. Let's talk about the Mercedes drivers holding 5th and 6th in the World Drivers' Championship, as we saw. In the Grand Prix, P3 for Hamilton, 4 for Russell. But hang on a second, let's rewind to Friday. I like qualifying on Friday night. I like these sprint format weekends. Keeps us busy. In qualifying, Russell was 4th, perhaps no surprises. Hamilton 9th, having crashed, but they both crashed. So what do you think about that? Both Mercedes cars crashing.
Well, they're trying. Both drivers trying very hard. The car is getting better, so you can't just blame the car as being undrivable. It is getting better. They're just the drivers trying a bit harder. Both drivers knew that they had a car that's capable of qualifying in the top 3, and I think that's what they were laser focused on. They wanted to show the progress that's been made, and sometimes that happens. It's going to be a new experience for Mercedes, but the amount of time you see midfield teams with a chance of having a really good performance, and they want it so bad, and they overreach sometimes and make a small mistake. But we're just used to seeing the midfield teams do it so much more, and it's interesting to see Mercedes that they're having to push so hard right now. And actually, I like it. I like seeing them being out of their comfort zone, and they're having to push harder to try and get back to the front. Yeah,
and essentially, Toto Wolff talked about they made 2 flaws out of 3 sort of broken ones, and they rebuilt Lewis's car around the spare tub. His 3rd consecutive 3rd place. Despite all of that, Mercedes now having 7 third places. Lewis finished 30 seconds off at the end. But the question here is, was it a false result because of the 2 other failures, or do you think Mercedes now are starting to get with the pace of Red Bull and Ferrari?
Oh, I think they are definitely getting closer, and it'd be interesting. We should maybe do that next time we do this. Is seeing the qualifying delta between the front for Mercedes and how it's closed over the last few races, because they're definitely closing it. And I'm enjoying watching them drive. Hamilton actually had a good drive. Yeah, in the end he finished 30 seconds off, but don't forget he was mired in that midfield battle. The opening laps, obviously P9, I think, for the opening laps, and he even made a mistake and one of the Haas got by him. So he really took his time to get to the front. And of course, Russell had incident-packed race, didn't he? He got that 5-second penalty for nudging off Perez, and which was deserved, I thought. And they had to change the rear wing.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sorry.
Let's talk about that, because I'm very interested that you said it was deserved. Lap 1, and let's just sort of set the scene here. Russell had started 4th, having finished 4th in the sprint. Perez had come up from 12th on the grid and had finished 5th, and then tries to go around the outside of Russell, lap 1, turn 4. Perez is on the outside, but ahead at the apex. And the 2022 rules, I think, and you can tell me if we're right here, say that it's whoever's ahead at the apex, regardless of inside or outside. But this is the output for Sergio, and really no surprise for anybody who's watched motor racing for more than about 5 minutes. But you think Russell penalty was correct?
Yeah, definitely. Because when you look at it, I mean, you could see both their arguments when you looked at both the replays. But if you slow down the Russell replay, you actually see that he takes a little bit too much curb at the apex. It bumps him up a little bit, and he's actually a bit wider than Perez would have expected him to be. Because when you're racing side by side someone, you're supposed to leave one car's width. If the guy's on the inside, you got to leave one car's width. You can't. The guy on the inside just can't imagine. But you're not required to leave any more. Sometimes you leave a bit more if you think that driver's unstable and out of control of his car and is going to hit you. But when you're racing top quality drivers, you want to squeeze them. You want to make sure you don't give him an inch more. And Perez did that. He gave him just one car's width, but he's perfectly allowed to give one car's width. He doesn't have to give 2 cars width, because then Russell, Perez will never overtake anyone. So I thought it was a good move by Perez. He left just enough space, and Russell got it a bit wrong. Just bounced off the curb a bit, went a bit wide, and touched Perez. So Russell deserved the penalty. Although I do hear Russell's remark about saying that Perez should have played the numbers game, because there was a high-risk move around that corner. We've seen contact around that corner so many times, and I do agree with that. Perez, again, maybe not the smart move around turn 4 on the first lap of the race.
It does seem so. And it feels to me also that we're having to adapt, aren't we, to a change in the paradigm almost, because in the past, and I say in the past because last year, was it last year or the year before when Albon and Lewis Hamilton clashed there, it was the other way around, the person who got the penalty. And I understand that the rules have changed, and you have to keep up to date. I don't know. I suppose that's a thing we're struggling to adapt with. I feel that the rules have changed not only from last year, but from ever in motor racing. Because my sense always, and my driver coach when I was driving, obviously I needed one a lot, was a guy called Rob Wilson. And Rob would often say, no one turns in until you turn in. If you're on the inside, no one's turning in. So I'm not saying Rob would say that now, because he wouldn't be suggesting break the rules. But there's kind of laws of physics that, to some degree, play on. Anyway, I get your point. Yeah. The rules are how they are now.
Yeah, and to be honest, the rules have been like this. Actually, this change of rule by giving space when someone's alongside you has been there. When did Verstappen first win? And when he drove Leclerc off, was that 2019? That was 2018, 2019. That rule was supposed to be there that year, but they couldn't implement it, and it's still been up and down, and they still can't implement it because that rule's supposed to be there. But Alonso was complaining about it in Silverstone. He said, people are just driving people off the road. I thought that wasn't allowed. And it's a very good point. I mean, I watched the racing. I enjoyed people watching as it went. And in our time, we are allowed to drive people off the road, inverted commas. When you're on the inside, you take your line. But they're trying to change that. And in America and Australia and various other different championships, they've had good success in that. But they've had to have rigorous stewarding to make it happen. And I've been on the stewards panel trying to make it happen as well. But
you're making a good point, because we had a question. I don't know whether we got it, whether we can show it to our viewers. We had a question on this exact point that you're making from Andrew Lawrenson, who kindly sent us some video clips on Twitter. And has then basically said, discuss, which we're doing, obviously, Andrew. So thanks for and he said, clip one this is Silverstone he's referring to here. Sergio Perez cutting the corner and forcing Leclerc off. Leclerc loses 2 places. That's the wonderful moment when it's Lewis Hamilton goes through, or through goes Lewis Hamilton, says Crofty. No penalty for anybody there. Clip 2 was Perez forcing Lewis off, Lewis losing 2 places, no penalty. And then at the end of the race, remember, we saw Max Verstappen rudely pushing Mick Schumacher off the racetrack. No penalties for any of those situations. And this was actually before the Grand Prix on Sunday, I suppose. Andrew was thinking already something's amiss here, because Albon pushes Lando Norris off in the sprint race and gets a 5-second penalty. So, okay, I don't want to sort of labour this point too much, but it does feel like there's some inconsistency even within the new regime.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and it's again enforcement. So you're right. The first 3 clips were the old style racing, where no penalty for that sort of one. Clip 4, which we saw in Red Bull Ring, where Albon got a penalty for taking Lando off, the 5-second penalty. That's the new way that they're trying to enforce it. But they're not enforcing it consistently in Europe, full stop. They're just not able to do it for some reason. And I think it's because they're not consistent with the driver stewards, not consistent with the stewards that come in. And I don't think they've trained the stewards properly on this. Because you need to have a proper seminar on what you want to try to achieve with your racecraft rules. Because they're able to do it in America, they're able to do it in Australia, and everyone seems to fall in line with that. So, and the difficulty is this: it's a bit like football. I might have brought this up to you before, Matt. In the 90s or the noughties, when they were trying to get people to stop taking each other out in big tackles because they wanted to see the game more flowing, there was a huge period for a few years where they really struggled to implement this. But then the referees got a lot better at saying, no, this is not allowed, and they were much more stricter on what it was acceptable, and they were consistent. And then you saw the game change, and then you saw people like Lionel Messi come in, and the other players who came in, which weren't taken out in tackles all the time, but they could dribble around and do something quite pretty. It's the same what we're trying to do here with the regs, is you're trying to let these cars race around side by side, but you have to be really strict with how you enforce it, and you have to be very clear with what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Because the drivers are all getting confused, because one weekend you're allowed to do this, and one weekend you're not allowed to do this. And they just want consistency. Are we allowed to run people off the road? Let us know. If we are, great. And if we're not, you need to be very clear on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, because it's a new way of driving by not allowing, by giving some people space. And it's something that all the sim racers do. because they're very strict on this about giving people space. And what happens is you see these battles that don't just happen for 1 or 2 corners. You see these battles happen for half a lap. And it's quite interesting because you're basically running in your own groove. But you need to be able to explain it to the driver stewards, who need to be very precise about how they want to do it, because most of the driver stewards are old like us, who prefer to see them race when we run people off the road. You know what I mean? Sorry, that's a really long answer.
In the good old days.
I hope it's clear. Yeah.
Well, no, you did. And in fact, let's show a question that was coming in, actually, as you were speaking. There's a question that very nicely summarizes, if you like, your answer, which was almost designed for Alex, was what were your thoughts on drivers' frustrations on track limits, given how the cars on these 18-inch tyres make sight quite a big problem. Let's just touch on that as well, because during the Grand Prix, track limit penalties applied to 4 drivers, Pierre Gasly, Lando Norris, Zhou Guanyu and Sebastian Vettel, each of them getting a 5-second time penalty on their race time, and plus 1 penalty point actually on their licenses. So this is a slightly it's related, isn't it? Because it's a rule and it's now being applied strictly. And what are your thoughts on that?
Who was race director? I bet Eduardo was race director on the weekend.
I think it was Niels Wittich this week and Eduardo was last week. I think.
Oh, was it Niels?
Pretty confident. But same thing, right? That's your point, is that one week it's this somebody, and also the stewards are different every week, and the driver steward's different.
Yeah. So Eduardo's very strict on track penalties. So when I saw them getting on the track penalties, I thought Eduardo was maybe doing it. But okay, so Niels was doing it. So it's a bit like the racecraft thing, where you're allowed to push. Sometimes you allow people to get away with pushing people off because it's really hard to give the space, and you've bombed from someone. Same with track limits. It's sometimes some corners it's very hard to stick on the white line. Maybe because of the tire, but I think it's more just because of the way that the corner is designed, that sometimes you're blind over a brown. It's very hard to see where the edge of the track is. So on those sort of corners, like the last 2 corners of Red Bull Ring, it used to be you just use the curb. And that's great, because when you run up on the curb, you can feel the curb, and okay, I got to there, that's it, I don't go any further. But with a white line, you're like, where's the white line? I can't quite see it. So it's really hard to see. And that's the drivers end up looking silly, because all of them just end up with track limit penalties. So again, it is going to be tricky. So the question is, do we try and be sensible and say, let's use the curb sometimes because it's hard to feel the white line and see the white line? Or do we be really stringent about it and say, no, white line is it, and that's all it's going to be for the rest of the time, and the drivers just have to get on with it and figure out a way to not cross that white line?
Well, because I was thinking at the time when I heard, I think it was Lando saying it's very difficult to see. I was thinking, well, it's very difficult to see probably when you're coming through Casino Square over the bump there, but we don't see drivers crashing into the front door of Rosie's Tip Top nightclub or whatever it's called there and saying, I just couldn't see where I was going. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be delighted to know that we're going to look at the World Constructors' Championship standings, because the whole point of talking about the Mercedes drivers finishing in 3rd and 4th was that on having 22 point scoring opportunities, 11 races times 2, they've scored points on 20 occasions, and that puts the Mercedes team solidly there in 3rd position. They've only failed to score once each in 11 rounds. That's pretty impressive. By contrast, the top 4 drivers in the championship, 2 from Red Bull, 2 from Ferrari, have all failed to score at least twice so far. Perez hasn't scored 3 times and Carlos Sainz 4 times. At the top of the standings there, we can see that Red Bull is now 56 points ahead of Ferrari. It's dropped down a little bit from 63. But the biggest battle is the one where the points are equal, 81 points equal. McLaren ahead of Alpine on scoring backwards, so to speak. It was 6 points, the delta beforehand. Let's talk about that battle between McLaren and Alpine. And Tessa's been working overtime on a couple of graphics for us. We like graphics. And you're going to like this one. Yeah. So we're going to look at the point scoring comparison, I think, first of all, between the 2 teams at this Austrian Grand Prix. Coming into the weekend, McLaren had 73 points and Alpine 67. We can have a look at that graphic now on the screen. You're going to see this nice bar graph. I think we're going to see this nice bar graph. Tell me if I'm wrong. Here it is. Just be patient. And as you can see now, McLaren have 73 points. This is before the weekend starts. Alpine have 67. 6 points is the gap. In the sprint race, only one of the 4 drivers scores a point. Esteban Ocon scores 3 points, and that brings the gap down to just 3. And in the Grand Prix, Esteban scores another 10 points for finishing 5th in his 100th Grand Prix. Fernando Alonso scores another 1 point for 10th. And then the two McLarens, Norris scores 6 points for finishing 7th, and Daniel Ricciardo, only his 3rd point scoring finish of the year, scores 2 points for finishing in 9th. So I guess the question there is, they're now equal on points, Alex. Are you surprised by how well the Enstone team, how well Alpine is doing this year?
Yes, very pleasantly surprised, because this is actually my favorite battle to watch this year between these two teams. I mean, both teams have history. Let's not forget, Danny Rick went from Alpine to McLaren, well, then Renault. So there's a bit of history there anyway. So this battle is going to be really tasty to watch for the whole year. I think both Ocon and Alonso are doing a great job scoring a lot of points right now, and the car is getting really good. McLaren, though, they need Ricciardo to get stronger if they're going to try and finish ahead of Alpine. But yeah, this is a great little battle between them. I'm very impressed with how this car has come along, and especially in Alonso's hands. I know Ocon scored more points, but I've been more impressed with some of Alonso's drives, and I think this team probably looks odds-on favourite to beat McLaren, just purely on the form of the last 3 races. Because McLaren they're not being as consistent, right? And just if I might add, Haas really should be in that battle too as well, shouldn't they?
Well, they might get there. Let's also look at, there's another one I want you to see, because Tessa's second graph is even more exciting, I think. I know how you like graphs like this, Alex, with this one especially for you, which is what I'm calling anyway, it's the McLaren recovery graphic. Because on Friday, McLaren had a lot of problems. They had DRS issues on Daniel Ricciardo's car that really interrupted his free practice running. And Lando Norris had a problem with his new power unit fitted for this weekend, had to go back to the old one. They had a brake-by-wire issue in qualifying. So they qualified, as you can see, Lando Norris 15th, Daniel Ricciardo 16th, compared to 5th and 8th for the two Alpine cars. The McLarens recovered really nicely to 10th and 11th, whereas unfortunately Fernando Alonso, to your point, dramatic always Fernando, having qualified 8th, the car wouldn't start on the grid, and he started essentially in the pit lane, started 19th, because there were 2 cars in the pit lane, himself and Zhou Guanyu. And then in the Grand Prix, 5th for Ocon, 7th and 9th for Norris and Ricciardo, 10th for Alonso. So it was a sort of damage limitation, bit of a recovery situation for McLaren. The other thing, Alex, I was looking at this, I was trying to work out what's really happening between McLaren and Alpine. I looked back at the last 11 races to see if I could see any kind of pattern in the results, and I can't see one. It seems to me that when there's a weekend when McLaren's doing well, Alpine doesn't, and vice versa. Do you think the cars are suited to different circuits, or is it the engines? Is anything about them?
I think definitely the cars are suited to different tracks. Especially in the beginning of the year, I thought you'd see the yo-yo effect quite a bit more. But I think Alpine have found something now, because the car looks a bit more consistent. I don't see it being so inconsistent. Was it 3 races now? They've had top 10 qualifying at 3 very different tracks. Was it Canada, Britain, and then of course Red Bull Ring? So those are very different tracks now. So Alpine, I don't think they've cracked something about that car, and it's going well. Miss McLaren, though, you saw that the qualifying performance for Red Bull was nowhere, but somehow they got both cars into the race. So they're still missing tricks with that car, which has been a trend since the very beginning. Let's not forget how quick they were in preseason testing, and then they were nowhere in Australia because of the brake issues and stuff. But they still got a bit of head scratching to do, and maybe they're a little bit in the Mercedes boat. And that makes me now wonder, is it a power unit issue where they're still trying to understand how to get the most out of their cars?
Absolutely. Well, McLaren then, as we just said, fighting now for 4th in the Constructors' Championship. Then they're going to need to collaborate very strongly, both within and with their partners. One of their partners is WebEx from Cisco. They're the official collaboration partner of the Go F1 show. Let's hear from them now.
Who's got the best fans?
That's a very good question.
Let's put up a poll.
Come on, England.
Jayo!
Allez!
Look who's got the best fans.
Yes!
With WebEx, the McLaren F1 team and their fans are competing like never before. WebEx, driving hybrid work.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Go F1 show. We're reviewing the Austrian Grand Prix that was won by Ferrari's Charles Leclerc, with Max Verstappen finishing second and taking the point for fastest lap, and Lewis Hamilton finishing third for Mercedes. His third podium in a row. So things are getting better for the 7-time world champion. And things are also getting better for Mick Schumacher, the son of a 7-time world champion. Let's talk about the Haas team, because both drivers have scored points in both of the last 2 races. In the World Constructors Championship, they're now 7th. You mentioned this earlier, Alex. They're catching up with the battle in the midfield. They were 7 points behind AlphaTauri coming into this weekend. They're now 7 points ahead. So another good haul of points has really helped them. I guess the question really is, first of all, Kevin Magnussen, he's in 11th in the World Drivers' Championship on 22 points. Mick scored his first points just a week ago at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone and added 8 more in Austria with a 6th place. How impressed were you with that 6th place?
Okay, so I am getting a bit impressed with Mick Schumacher. I think if it was any other driver, I'd be saying 2 races does not make a season. 2 races does not mean anything. But we've watched Mick Schumacher quite closely, and we saw him do this in F3, and we saw him do this in F2, where he always started slowly in the category. But when he figured stuff out, he would get stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think this could be the start of a run, because his performance, in Britain and Austria were really impressive. He looked to be the better driver when you compared him with Magnussen. And we know how much we were rating Magnussen at the beginning of the year. So I'm quite impressed by Mick, and I don't think it is a false storm, because we know how he drives. And I think when he figures stuff out, he really figures stuff out. So I think he's going to have a strong year now.
I think you're making a really interesting point, because at the end of the British Grand Prix, we mentioned this earlier, Max Verstappen was rather rude, I thought, to Mick. And in defence, okay, he's trying to get the final points, but pushing Mick off the racetrack at Silverstone. And then in the sprint race on Saturday, Mick was obviously quite clearly feeling he was faster than Kevin, and the team understandably probably thought, well, yeah, you're in the DRS, so we can't really judge how quick you are. But Mick was pretty irritated, wasn't he, post-race, and saying, well, I shouldn't have even been in a battle with Lewis Hamilton, because I should have been ahead of my teammate, which I thought was completely new to see Mick speaking in that way.
Yeah, and he needs to. He needs to. Haas have a good car this year. They started strongly, then they lost their way. But then the last 2 races, you can see in both cars getting strong again. So they have got a good car, and they need a driver to be strong and pushing. And I think Mick doing this is good for the team, because it will raise everyone's level. I don't think he's doing it in a way which can be detrimental to the team. I actually think this is going to excite the team more.
Absolutely. Well deserved, Mick Schumacher, driver of the day for the Austrian Grand Prix. And the Haas team, they might be only 7th at the moment in the Constructors' Championship. You've got to say, in terms of the social media championship, whoever their admin is doing a fine job, because this is absolutely brilliant. Top Gunt at the Haas F1 team, Gunther Steiner. This is from the team's own social media handle. Absolutely brilliant. Love to see this kind of behaviour. It's really the modern day Formula One. I think we've got one more example of how Haas present themselves. This is great. Yeah, boys. Fantastic. Not taking themselves too seriously off the track, but very much taking the racing seriously, which is exactly what we like to see. So fantastic job from Haas. We had a great chat, of course, with Gunther Steiner recently. That's available on the Go F1 Show YouTube channel. And Stu, the lovely PR person at Haas, doesn't know yet, but I'm about to text him and say, can we have a chat with Mick? I'd like to catch up with Mick, please.
Yeah. Absolutely. We should definitely try and talk to him.
Question.
Worth talking to him.
I think it is worth catching up with him. It's been a year or so. I think we've got a question coming in on this topic, and it's actually from Indonesia, from Balwark in Indonesia. He's asking a question which is a really good point. He's wondering, on the topic of Haas, same engine in the back, the Ferrari, as in the Ferrari, of course, and the Alfa Romeo, but it seems like it's more reliable in the back of the Haas. What do you think? Is there any possibility that somehow the installation or other factors mean that the engine's more reliable?
Gosh, it shouldn't be. And I'd be shocked if operationally Alfa Romeo and Ferrari doing something that made it worse. It could just be statistics. We need more numbers to really tell. Maybe over the course of the season, we might see that reflect that Haas has more failures. But yeah, at the moment, it's looking good. Maybe the engineers are just getting the numbers right and aren't running the engines so close to the line.
Yeah, whatever it is, touch wood, let's hope it continues. It's great to see the Haas team doing well. And let's look at the next race coming up. Let's look actually at the next 8 or 9 races. I think we've got to show you in the 22 races, 8 races here from rounds 12 through 19. Of course, 22 races in this championship, but we're just showing you the next race is the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, and then the Hungarian Grand Prix the week after, and then we go into the summer break. And I guess, you're doing very well this season, Alex, at predicting. So tell us what you think is going to happen in France. Not only, I'm going to put you under pressure here, not only between Ferrari and Red Bull, but whether Mercedes might continue their run of strong form in France.
Ooh, that's a good one, actually. I was just going to say, France and Hungary are front-limited tracks. So you're going to say that it's going to be Red Bull there for sure. But especially France, actually, I want to see how Mercedes go. I think that'd be quite interesting to see how quick they are. If they can close down the gap, wouldn't it be great to see them pull off a win this year after all the hard work that they've gone through? And a bit further down, Belgium and Netherlands, they look like Red Bull tracks as well.
There we go. We've heard it first here, ladies and gentlemen. Also, a quick shout out, because he's going to also be driving in the French Grand Prix supporting race in Formula 2 to friend of the Go F1 show, our guest, Roberto Meri, who he also joined us from Japan. It's obviously a good thing, who was super subbing in the Formula 2 race for Ralph Boschung, who's unfortunately injured. And Roberto did a rather good job. He finished on the podium. Of course, he raced in Formula 2 when it was called GP2 back in the day, but he also raced in F1 7 years ago. So Roberto not only got onto the podium, but it now means that he's the oldest, he won't like me saying this, he's the oldest driver ever to score a podium in GP2 or Formula 2 at the ripe old age, Alex, would you believe, of 31. Put a shout out there. Exactly. Yeah. Shout out to our friend Roberto. And he's going to be continuing to replace Ralph in that car, at least for the French Grand Prix, with Ralph's blessing. Absolutely. You can see all those discussions on Twitter. And of course, you can catch up with our conversation, if you missed it, with Roberto on our YouTube channel. There it is. Just search Go F1 Show. Lots of conversations with various luminaries from within the sport. Colton Herta, as you may know, is test driving a McLaren today and indeed tomorrow. He's hoping to race in Formula 1. This is the IndyCar star I'm talking about. We had a chat with Colton earlier in the year. Just one example of many conversations that you can find on the Go F1 Show YouTube channel. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our Grand Prix debrief for the Austrian Grand Prix. Just remains for me to say, please continue to follow us, to like us, to subscribe, whatever else you need to do, and to say thank you very much to Alex Yoong for joining us tonight.
Yeah, good to be here, mate.
Take care. Thanks very much. See you next time.